I am at ETSI Security Week, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Curtis Dukes from the Center for Internet Security, and we're going to be talking a bit about the state of cybersecurity policy in the US. Thank you so much, Curtis, for joining me. Could you perhaps start by just explaining your background a little bit in security and introducing yourself?
Yeah, you bet. So I've been in security for around 4 decades.
Mm-hmm.
So by definition, I'm old. And I started out 5 years in the United States Air Force,
Mm-hmm.
and then went to school on the USGI Bill, got my undergraduate and graduate degrees in computer science. And then I went to work for the National Security Agency for a little over 3 decades. And now for the last 5.5 years, I've been at the Center for Internet Security. But all through those different positions, it's always been around what we call the defensive mission, or around what was information security, and then information assurance, and now cybersecurity.
Oh, fantastic. And can you explain a little bit about the Center for Internet Security and what it does?
Yep. So we are a nonprofit headquartered in the United States. And really, we have 2 missions. First mission is around establishment and promulgation of cybersecurity best practices.
Okay.
And then the second mission is on behalf of the Department of Homeland Security. We actually provide cyber threat intelligence and sharing with the U.S. 56 states and tribal areas and territories.
Okay, fantastic. And just to kind of start, could you please give a background of cybersecurity and the landscape in the US at the moment, and perhaps some of the key issues in cybersecurity there at the moment?
Yeah, so in the US, in the last year and a half, it's been principally focused around combating ransomware.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'll see that there's been legislation around establishing cyber breach reporting requirements.
Okay.
And so there's been a lot of debate whether it should be as small as 12 hours upon breach. You have to notify the U.S. government, all the way up to 96 hours. And so I think it's going to navigate and end up somewhere around 72 hours. And that really gives organizations time
Mm-hmm.
to actually understand, what's occurred, and then be able to fully brief the government on that. So that's point 1. And then point 2 is really around shoring up cybersecurity within our critical infrastructure. And so there's 13 critical infrastructure sectors within the United States, and we need to do some investment in each one of those.
Some examples being?
Yeah, so 2 examples. One is water.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is around energy. And so they're both hugely important to U.S. citizens, I would say, to everyone globally. And so typically they're underfunded, and we need to do a better job there.
Okay, and are there kind of some major policies at the moment that you would like to talk about?
Yeah, so I guess the one has one is an executive order from the president. Really was around requiring certain things of the government, the federal government, and that in things like multi-factor authentication, as I said, cyber breach reporting, movement to the cloud, and then also on acquisition reform within that. So that's one of the major ones, and then the other one really is around, as I said, cyber breach reporting. So
okay, and just out of interest, how much cybersecurity policy, cybersecurity kind of regulations are come through the government or come through more the private sector?
Historically, it came through the government, and I'll give you one example where it actually ended up in a collaboration between government and the private sector, and that was around the Colonial ransomware event. Colonial is the name of a pipeline vendor in the U.S., and so based on that cyber breach, the government, in this case it was the Transportation Security Administration, actually dictated a certain number of security requirements for that sector, and unfortunately, the sector said, that's too much given what where we fit within the ecosystem, and so then they engaged in a dialogue, and they actually updated the security requirements and made it a little bit more less onerous on on that sector for that. So that's really it's what we're moving towards is a public-private partnership between government and industry on what is the right level of cybersecurity requirements that they should be baselined and then measured against.
Yeah. And that kind of leads me on nicely to my next question, which is about the future of cybersecurity in the US and where you think it's going.
Yeah, I really believe that it takes a village, but in this case, the village is not just in the U.S., but it's a global village.
Yeah.
And so we have to work collaboratively amongst nations in establishment of good cybersecurity standards. An example I would cite would be supply chain risk management, right? And so currently, each nation is kind of approaching it independently, but I do think we have to kind of work together and establish what would be a baseline set of requirements, and then from that, each nation would then enforce those requirements within its industries, for that.
Yeah, that's something that's come up a lot in the last couple of days is harmonization of standards and standards bodies working together. As we are an ETSI Security Conference, could you just talk about ETSI's role with standards and the US?
Yeah, we've had a long history. Certainly in my career, probably I've been associated with ETSI for a little over 2 decades.
Okay.
And what I like about ETSI is that it looks at it globally, and again, we have many nations represented here at ETSI for these couple of days during the security conference, and I just think it's an opportunity for us. The other piece is with different standards bodies, not only ETSI but say the International Standards Organization. It may be that they're a good standard development there, but then it gets endorsed by, for in this case, ETSI or vice versa.
And you said obviously the dream is to kind of harmonize these standards a bit more. But what are really the challenges of trying to kind of have joint ventures between nations in cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think what it is a little bit of not invented here syndrome. And what I mean by that is that each nation still thinks that they need to. They're the only ones that can come up with that standard. And as opposed to actually trying to work collaboratively and taking whatever is the best idea. I just recently was in a talk around cybersecurity labeling.
Yeah.
And so it's a prime example where the Singapore cybersecurity administration created a labeling scheme, and now we have other countries, Germany and Finland and others, that have come up with a similar labeling scheme. And now it's important for each of those nations to actually endorse each other's labeling scheme. And so maybe we get to a point where instead of a vendor has to have their product evaluated in each one of those schemes, that there's reciprocity with them. So I think that's the direction we're heading. In the U.S., we're through our National Institute for Standards and Technology. We're coming up with a labeling scheme as well. Okay. And again, for me, the next step would be to actually mutual recognition between the different countries, and so that whether a product is evaluated in that country, it would be accepted in the U.S.
Okay, interesting. And something I just want to finish with, at Cybersecurity Magazine, we do a lot about cybersecurity awareness. Not from obviously the consumer level, the manufacturer level, and so on. How would you see cybersecurity awareness currently in the US at the moment?
It's a work in progress. What I mean by that is I think the US is waking up to the need for more awareness around just good or basic cyber hygiene. And I think this focus around, again, to labeling, it's an opportunity for consumers to understand that when they buy that product that it has undergone a certain level of assessment and it meets a certain standard when it comes to cybersecurity best practices. But for us, within government, we've had a long history of cybersecurity awareness, but I think less so when it comes to the consumer, and I think that's the journey we're currently on.
Okay, and so would you say that the responsibility perhaps is less on the consumer, more on the manufacturers, the standards bodies by using these sort of labeling systems?
It's definitely on the government and the manufacturers, right? And so it's on the government to work with the manufacturers to come up with what is reasonable cybersecurity for that product, and then be able to assess that. That way, the consumer then has confidence that that their product is safe, and, if you will, it's not easy for an adversary to take advantage of that product. So I think that's the journey we're on. I do believe that government and industry are working more closely, and so now we have to work on educating, if you will, the consumer around cybersecurity best practices.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me, Curtis. I hope you have a great rest of the week.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and look forward to the remainder of the week.